The ignorance and incompetence of politicians is the special curse of democracies. Democracy is a charming form of government, full of variety and disorder, and dispensing a sort of equality to equals and unequals alike. The words of the great Greek philosopher Plato. Good evening and welcome. We're talking history on News Talk 106 to 108 with me, Patrick Geoghegan. And in tonight's show, we're looking at the history of democracy. In his new study on Athenian democracy, the scholar Thomas Mitchell suggests that following the collapse of communism in 1989, a wave of euphoria swept over proponents of democracy, with extravagant claims that democracy was now the natural form of polity for civilized societies, a force for peace, prosperity and progress, and the protector of human rights and liberties. But, as Mitchell suggests, the reality over the past 26 years has not quite matched the euphoria. Today, only about 43% of the world's population lives in societies that might be classified as free and democratic. The principles of democracy, people power, began in Athens almost 2,500 years ago and flourished for almost 2 centuries. At the same time, a related form, republicanism, began and evolved in Rome. But both had disappeared by the time of the birth of Christ, and it was only in the 17th century that there was a revival of interest in democratic ideals and systems. Mitchell defines democracy as an ideology, a set of political ideals derived from a particular view of the nature, dignity, and social needs of human beings. Another classicist, Geoghegan, has described democracy as one of the rarest, most delicate, and fragile flowers in the jungle of human experience. There are many different types of democratic systems, and the most popular today is representative democracy, where we elect our leaders every few years. But critics of this system suggest that it is the rule of the politicians, not the rule of the people. So, does democracy work? And how has it evolved over the centuries? In tonight's show, we want to explore the past, present, and future of democracy. And to help me do this, I'm delighted to welcome our panel of experts. Professor Paul Cartledge is A.G. Leventis Senior Research Fellow at Clare College, Cambridge, and Emeritus Professor of Greek Culture at the University of Cambridge. The author of many books, including Ancient Greek Political Thought and Practice. His new book, Democracy, a Life, will be published by Oxford University Press on the 1st of March. Dr. Rosalind Fuller is a Canadian-Irish author and international law lecturer and is the author of Beasts and Gods, How Democracy Changed Its Meaning and Lost Its Purpose. She is an independent candidate in the forthcoming general election. Dr. Peter Stone lectures in the Department of Political Science at Trinity College Dublin and is an expert on contemporary political theory with particular interest in theories of justice and democratic theory. And he's the author of The Luck of the Draw, The Role of Lotteries in Decision Making. Well, you're all very welcome. And later in the show, I'll be talking to Ian Walker, the Managing Director of New Democracy in Australia, an academic think tank that explores new ways of making democracy more effective. Well, Paul, we might begin with you as, you've been a guest on our first show and indeed many more since then. And we might begin with, I think, the word democracy. Is the etymology as simple as the combination of people and power?
It certainly is not. As you can imagine, nothing is simple when we're doing political thought and political practice. And though Tom Mitchell was right that democracy, ancient democracy, or even modern democracy is an ideology, it's also a practice. So the problem about the demokratia, which is the original Greek word on which all modern forms of democracy are based, the problem with it is its ambiguity in the first element of the 2 elements. So it's a combination of demos and kratos, and demos, as you rightly said, can mean people. But which people? Do we mean all the people? So that's to say, all people of sound mind who are above voting age, of whatever gender? Or do we mean, and now in the ancient Greek terms, they didn't, of course, empower women, and they had slaves, and there were resident aliens who were not empowered. So living in one community which would be called a democracy, maybe only 15% of the total population would be empowered. In other words, have the access potentially to the kratos. But it's not even as simple as that. It's even more complex than that, because demos can mean both all the empowered citizens, so all the adult male citizens, correct birth, properly enrolled, above a certain age, free, legitimate, etc. But it can also, and this is actually the origins of the fact that in the Western tradition, democracy is typically termed in a negative way. And that's because demos can also mean the masses, the majority of the empowered people who are not necessarily terribly bright, who are not necessarily wealthy. Or to be crude, if you are an anti-democrat, they are poor, they are stupid, they are uneducated, and therefore they are really incapable of taking a proper political view.
Very interesting. And it's a complicated story because when we think of the origins of democracy, we point the finger at ancient Greece, we maybe say Athens, but actually some of your work has teased that out, and it's not a story of one different system, that there were a number of different types of democracy, even in Athens over a 200-year period.
You're quite right, and as you said, it was indeed Athens that pioneered it, and I should just preface everything I say by pointing out that there are people who think that democracy is not or should not be regarded as a uniquely ancient Greek invention, that other cultures, other communities have had forms of, in some sense, involvement, in some sense, almost having a say. I myself I'm afraid I'm rather reactionary on this. I do think that the Greeks, first because they invented a form of political community which enabled popular participation, the polis, but also because, as a matter of fact, the word is a Greek invention, no one doubts that. And that you can give it a history and you can point to a particular moment or series of moments round about 500 BC, let's say between 500 and 450 BC, within which one particular group of citizens, polis people, acquired the rudiments of the ability to run their own affairs, to make decisions by mass meeting, such that a majority of a particular gathering decided what the laws were, what the particular foreign policy or domestic policy, and so on. But, as you correctly say, Athens was Athens, and there were about 1,000 different Greek communities. At any one time, perhaps as many as 250 had some form of democracy. But when Aristotle, who was the greatest political analyst of the ancient Greeks, and indeed one of the greatest ever, when he sat down and tried to analyze critically the different forms of democracy, he decided there were four. Well, we needn't worry about them, but the point is this, that some were more moderate, some more extreme, such that the more moderate were least democratic, if you see what I mean, and most like forms of government, self-government, that were not democratic, so oligarchic, rule of the few in some sense. So Athens actually went through 3 or 4 varieties of democracy, and indeed it suffered. I'm a Democrat, so I call it suffered 2 bouts of reaction when the opponents of democracy within Athens, Athenians who didn't like it, and enemies of Athens who were very happy for Athens to undergo a revolution of a negative kind. There were 2 occasions when Athens suffered oligarchic counter-revolutions. So as you rightly say, it's not a simple history. There are many democracies, many Greek cities, and even Athens is not a simple case.
Excellent. Rosalind, so it's a complicated story. When we look at the early attempts at democracy and democratic systems, how did they compare with democracies today? Would we be able to look back on them and recognise similar things, or are they very different?
I'd say that on balance, very different. I think a lot of people today wouldn't necessarily recognize themselves in a society like ancient Athens. I don't think the ancient Athenians would really recognize a democracy in what we practice today. One characteristic of Athens was the idea that all citizens were more or less fit to serve equally in a democracy, and therefore they preferred to hand out government posts using a lottery system. They actually had a little machine that did this, made out of stone with a metal funnel. It was quite complex, but they would use this to hand out various government positions, and they reserved elections for very, very few posts. For example, the post of a general, where it was felt that one had to have a specific, a certain amount of expertise there. Another difference was that, of course, the Athenians met in assembly. They decided directly on most issues. They made most laws and decrees directly. And their court system was also somewhat different than our own. There's a bit of a similarity here in that in Athens, courts were jury courts, and the citizens who staffed those courts were also chosen randomly to sit on those courts on more or less a daily basis. And of course, we can kind of see that still. That's one point of similarity, really, to modern society, is the jury system that we use to decide guilt or innocence, where citizens are also randomly selected.
And Rosalind, did it work? Because you mentioned they're electing generals. That would seem to me a silly way of proceeding, because I would want the state to be able to know who was the best general rather than us sitting around and maybe having a vote about it.
Well, in Athens, of course, a lot of the male citizen population would have been involved very intimately in warfare, so they did have a pretty good idea of who is a good general, and most of the people who would be voting would actually be serving under those generals. So I think for their society, it seems to have worked quite well for a long time.
Peter, you've done a huge amount of work on this whole idea of lotteries and going back from ancient times to possible applications in the present. How effective was it?
Well, it was actually very effective because they were very smart about the way that they used it. It wasn't anything simply like, well, all right, well, we're going to select the president of Athens now, so we'll just randomly pick somebody there. They didn't actually have an office like president. What they did is that they created a large number of offices, and they would try to make them the kind of offices so that they would break down responsibilities such that for any particular office, the ordinary person would be able to handle them. And then in order to provide an additional level of protection, they would never select, or almost never selected, one individual and charge them with a task. They would select a board of people. They'd say, all right, we'll select 10 people who will inspect the docks, or we'll expect 10 people who will make sure that the rules are being followed at the marketplace, or that kind of thing. So they actually were very, very careful about trying to figure out how can you actually use lotteries to empower ordinary citizens in order to make the state work. And they were generally very successful at that, I think.
And when you look at the early systems, do you think they were effective?
Well, the proof of the pudding, as they say, is in the eating, and Athens certainly was a system that was very successful, wildly successful. In fact, I mean, the golden age of democracy was in Athens was also the era when Athens was the most prosperous and powerful state in the entire Greek world. In fact, it got so prosperous and powerful that it wound up controlling its own empire, basically, in the 5th century, and it made all of the other states so jealous of it that resulted in the Peloponnesian War. So you can't say it was, they weren't all jealous and scared of Athens because it was such a failure. They were jealous and scared of it because it was such a success.
Excellent. So, Paul, what went wrong then? If this was such a triumph of ingenuity, well, I suppose Peter's hinting at there is jealousy and some tensions, but I suppose I'm having trouble kind of understanding where democracy went wrong then. How come it disappeared for so long?
Well, it's not so much that it went wrong. As I say, there were always people who, if you are not one of the masses, if you are one of, let me call them the elite, so that you're smarter, you're richer, you're better educated and so on, you think democracy is the world turned upside down. It's the inferiors ruling the superiors. Then you're always going to be looking for ways in which to undermine the system or to take advantage of weakness, of failure. And Peter's very rightly just mentioned the Peloponnesian War. Well, without going into all the reasons, a very long war The Athenians lost it, and as a consequence, they lost their democracy briefly. Now, why did they lose it? A combination of internal forces, at, say, extreme right wing, I could call them that, oligarchs. The Greek word was dynasts, a sort of junta almost took over. But in order to rule, they were propped up by a garrison, and a foreign garrison of ex-unfree people whom the Spartans imposed upon them. So Sparta itself, though it was a funny kind of state, was never a democracy of the Athenian kind. Just to give one instance, they didn't vote by raising their right hands or by using a ballot. They voted by shouting. So they didn't have the notion of one citizen, one vote, who should be counted as one and no one for more than one, the classic democratic way. And of course, Sparta is a very military society. Well, that's just one instance of what democracy is up against. And of course, Athens was the most prominent, the most successful, the richest, the most powerful democratic state in the classical Greek world. Well, it recovered, again, the reasons are complex. It recovered to actually remain a democracy for another 70-odd years, whereupon another major defeat, this time not by Sparta, but by, from the Athenian point of view, an autocrat, a king, a hereditary king, but one who ruled without being accountable to his people. He was a hereditary king with almost total power, Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. Well, as a result of that, Athens was up against, in fact, Athens was not alone in this, but many Greek states were subject to a foreign power or to a Greek power that was on the fringes of the old Greek world, Macedon. And Macedon was not keen on promoting democracy for obvious reasons. Democracies are much less stable. They're much more difficult to control by an outside power. So once Alexander took over, then Alexander dies, then the Athenians rose up against Macedon, but they made a terrible mistake. They miscalculated, and they lost both at sea and on land, and yet again, and this time more or less finally, their democracy was taken away. And the Greek world, after Alexander the Great, was transformed from a very, very dispersed system. I mentioned 1,000 city-states. Well, about 700 of them were in the Aegean area. And it went from being a system whereby there were many centers, polycentric, to one of which there were only 3 or 4 great powers. And the great powers were monarchs. They were dynasts. They were, if you were a Democrat, tyrants. So actually democracy didn't die. It was, I would put it this way, assassinated. And it took a very long time. The Romans just followed on from Macedon. They too were not keen on Greek-style primary democracy. They had a funny kind of democracy, if you can call it that, in their own republic. Very funny. A Greek would not have called it a democracy. But it was a republic, so anti-monarchy, but not pro-democracy. Well, the Romans ruled the Greeks from about the middle of the 2nd century BC onwards, and that was it. Greece, or Greek cities in the eastern Mediterranean, were part of a much bigger empire, and though they might achieve a degree of independence, they never were permitted to go anywhere near having the same sort of primary democratic system such as we've had described by Rosalind and by Peter.
We got a text message in, and I might put this to you, Peter. J. Vivian asks, how much do we really know about classical democratic practices, and how much of our view of ancient politics is shaped by the views of political thinkers in subsequent centuries who applied an idealised view to their contemporary needs?
Well, it's a great question, and the short answer is there's actually not an enormous amount of democratic theory written by the Athenians themselves, and because the Athenians, the most enthusiastic Athenians, of course, are the poor. They're not the best educated people. They're not the ones who are writing the books. The people who are writing the books are the people who are wealthier, who are aristocratic, and who, as pointed out already, are the most skeptical of democracy. And this tendency only built up over time as you started to see people in subsequent centuries writing about Athens. They tended to be oligarchic in their instincts, and the result is that they would tend to believe pretty much any story at all about ancient Athens that made it look bad. In fact, there are examples, for example, of stories of persecutions being carried out by the Athenians, and if you look at their sources, they're looking at satirical comedies that would have been performed on the stage in ancient Athens. They're taking these satires as if they were real documents about history. And so it's very hard. In fact, you have to be very carefully parse out the oligarchic bias in the subsequent sources if you to get an accurate picture of what's going on.
And what about Plato and Aristotle? Because Aristotle saw democracy as a corrupted form. Plato was critical. These were like our fundamental principles of philosophy kind of can be traced back to them, and that they were skeptical and critical.
Well, Plato is a great example because I think above all, Plato was very fearful of the level of turmoil in democracy. Now, what he called turmoil, you might consider as progress or experimentation, social experimentation, trying to figure out what worked the best. But he was very, very suspicious about that. He was very conservative in his instincts, very much about trying to solve social problems once and for all. And that's in many ways what he thought philosophy would do. It would give us answers once and for all that would solve our problems, so we wouldn't need to go having these constant ditherings in the assembly about it. Well, the fact is people are still arguing about philosophy 2,000 years later, so it's not exactly like he succeeded in doing that.
Very good. Rosalind, what about Rome? Because they were embarked on maybe it was slightly different. They were interested in republicanism and yet democracies, modern democracies like the United States base their system very heavily on the Roman model. So what was the Roman model like? Because we take so many things. Your book shows how things like modern electioneering, posters, campaigning, things you'll be involved with in the next few weeks. We take all of that from the Romans.
Yes, we do. I mean, I would say that Rome wasn't just slightly different from Athens. In its essence, it was very different as a society, but one that we would find much more recognizable today. As you said, a lot of our modern thinking about political organization actually stems from Rome. So the Romans had a system of elections. They would elect a variety of officials, most of them every year. The top two were the consuls, and then there were a lot of other officials underneath. These officials almost always came from the elite ranks of Roman society. In Rome, it took a great deal of money to get elected. It took a great deal of political influence to get elected, and a lot of connections. So those who governed Rome were pretty much exclusively the rich and well-connected, and they behaved in very similar ways to what we see people. It was a competitive, although they had a monopoly on who would win the elections, they competed with each other very, very strenuously to get those places, and they would engage, in exactly very similar behaviors to what we see today. They would get their friends to write endorsements for them and plaster them on every wall they could find. They would walk through the city with their followers behind them, shaking people's hands and acting like they cared about every person they came across.
Any actual kissing of babies?
I don't think there's actually any. I couldn't find a record of a Roman actually kissing a baby, but I'm sure if someone had suggested it to some of them, they would have seen it as a great opportunity. So perhaps from ignorance, they refrained.
And yet the Roman system also was degraded and corrupted, and we had an empire succeeding that and destroying the version of republicanism that it had.
Yeah, it's interesting that Paul said that democracy was assassinated, because what happened in Rome is that it actually kind of corrupted itself from inside. There was a great deal of social inequality in Rome, which gradually got worse and worse. Slaves became used to provide cheap labor that small farmers and traders couldn't compete with. And over time, more and more small traders and small farmers fell into bankruptcy. So Rome became polarized into the very rich and the very, very poor. And when a few politicians recognized this issue in Rome and they tried to correct it, they tried to say, look, we need to reorganize our society to provide a sort of basis of equality on which we can function. And those politicians were the Gracchi. They were assassinated by Rome's elite, and they just chugged on as they had been. And eventually, the society got more and more chaotic. Power was held in the hands of fewer and fewer people, and eventually they had a very, very tumultuous civil war, and after that, an empire.
And Paul, your work shows how the Romans hated the Athenian form of democracy and how everything changed so that I think by the time of the reign of Emperor Justinian, democracy was almost being used in place of the word riot.
You're right. Of course, we've got to factor in, after Augustus, a whole series of emperors. Then, in the early 4th century of our era, the Roman Empire divided physically but also governmentally into an east and a west. And so you've got a new Rome, that is Constantinople, which previously was Byzantium and is today Istanbul. And Constantine, of course, was not just an Eastern Roman emperor, the founder of the Eastern Roman Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire, but he was also the first Christian emperor. And so you get a whole new layer of, I would say, anti-democratic, by ancient Greek standards, thinking imported into Roman ideology from the Gospels, from Pauline doctrine about, for example, how you must render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and therefore there's a sharp divide between what you owe to the church and what you owe to secular authority. And the powers that be, Paul wrote once, are ordained of God. So it's as if whatever the situation is, and it was now an autocratic monarchy, that's not something ordinary people should even dream of wanting to change, because that would be somehow irreligious or even sacrilegious. So as you rightly say, there's a source in the 6th century, contemporary with Justinian, a guy called John Malalas, and he refers to the rioting which took place in the amphitheatre in Constantinople as demokratia. And what he's doing there is picking up on a strain of thinking which goes right back to the 5th century BC, which is to hold that the demos is really an oklos, because it's the majority, the masses, who are a mob. And so democracy is really ochlocracy, mob rule, and riot, well, what do you expect? And that picks up exactly what Peter said about Plato. This is what they feared, this is what they were frightened of, but what actually did not happen in the real democracy, but did happen, as Roslyn correctly said, in late Republican Rome.
Excellent. Well, one element of the ancient system that is having a bit of a revival at the moment is the idea of having that lottery system and then trying to have that feed into the system. It was something that Robert Dahl suggested in his book Democracy and Its Critics in 1989, the idea of the mini populace with 1,000 citizens randomly chosen and deliberating on major public issues and feeding into the process of government. It's something that our guest Peter Stone has developed in his book The Luck of the Draw. It's something that a number of leading scholars have been teasing out, and it's something that in this country we gave it a go with our Irish Constitutional Convention. Maybe not a huge success, but maybe there were other reasons for the reason why it wasn't a huge success. Well, they are thinking about this issue very heavily in Australia, and during the week I talked to Ian Walker, who's the Executive Director of New Democracy, and it's an academic think tank which explores how we can be innovative in the ways that we do our democratic process. And it was a very interesting interview, and I began by asking him to tell me about the background to New Democracy and the work they do.
The New Democracy Foundation is a private charity, and it was founded by a former political donor, someone who'd made a lot of donations over the years. His father had started a large infrastructure firm, and essentially one day at a political fundraising dinner stood up and said, I think you need to change things. Actually took the point of view that, a lot is said that people make political contributions out of civic contribution and goodness. And he challenged this idea and said, I'll write you one more check if you're prepared to change something. And unsurprisingly, the answer came they weren't prepared to change something. So he started to look into who was trying to innovate in democracy, and not finding anyone, created this foundation. So, look, in brief, we're the intersection of as many great ideas out there in universities and academia, and there's a world of mayors, ministers, premiers and prime ministers, and as New Democracy, we shuttle between the two of them, essentially seeking to trial good ideas in how we can do democracy better.
Very good. So this is all about innovation and democracy, and you're interested in more the narrow definition of democracy than the broad definition. In other words, you're interested in how we make trusted political decisions.
That's a really nice way of expressing it. You hear especially through the Arab Spring, people want democracy. And I understand that they want free speech, they want the rule of law. When you actually think about it, they're not clamouring for the chance to vote in a list. And it's a case of the one part of our democracy that's broken. And there are many parts of it that work really well, but the one part we see as broken is we're not making decisions that people trust. You can announce pretty much anything and you'll hear nothing but criticism and nothing but mistrust. Was something connected to a donor, to a trade union, to, name the group. And we see that lack of trust is really impeding the making of good decisions.
So what are the big ideas then that you're thinking of trialling or that you're hoping to trial? What's maybe a better way of making these decisions?
Look, at the core, the number one idea we want to see trialled is the increased use of random selection. We trust random selection for criminal juries, at least in Australia we do. And we can take 12 people picked at random, show them an array of evidence, let them hear multiple cases, let them hear from experts. If they find common ground, we act on that decision. And yet, a mayor trying to change how often the bins get picked up, a much more trivial decision, we'll find that people won't trust. They'll read in a conspiracy theory, anything behind it. So we are trialling randomly selected juries of, 35 and 40 people to see if they can address and find solutions to challenging public policy problems. And we're doing that in an increasingly large scale. We've done local government budgets, we've done issues to state premiers, and consistently we're seeing that governments can act on those on the results that come out.
So if this was to be successful, would that be the end of the professional politician, that we no longer have politicians, it would be these randomly selected citizens?
Look, I think politicians get a bad rap as well. They're easy to throw rocks at, and I think it's fun as well, so everyone likes to throw criticism their way. I think we would suggest that it's going to be a great complementary approach. You think in most parliaments where you have a lower house and an upper house, there's no point voting for them both. So maybe having one house that's randomly selected and one house that people vote for is a way to get more trust and confidence in both. I think if we go all the way back to, last year we had an anniversary of the Magna Carta. When people were unhappy with the king, they didn't get rid of the king, not everywhere, and instead they added a House of Parliament as well. We think with 800 years have passed, we could do with another layer of innovation, and perhaps we add one more House of the People, because elections on their own are not doing enough to allow us to make the decisions we need to take.
I see on your Democracy Now! Website you reference the Irish Constitutional Convention that we had in this country. But I suppose a criticism that people in this country would have of that experiment was that the government really ignored a lot of the recommendations and it only allowed itself to act on the kind of the ones they wanted to anyway, or the ones that weren't particularly important or controversial.
I think in any trial you don't get everything right up front, and you've got to avoid, letting the great be the enemy of the good. At its core, what it showed was that a group of people coming together and working with politicians in that case could actually make a sensible group of recommendations. That the decision-making is not the province of experts and our betters and the professional political class. Everyday people could come up with a set of recommendations. I'd be more concerned if the criticisms were, look at the rubbish these people came up with, and that's not it. We absolutely focus on negotiating authority for the decisions up front. And, in a project 6 or 7 years ago, we were probably similarly as ambitious in having a fix all the world's problems kind of question being asked of citizens. And you learn from that, you probably want to take a narrower topic, a narrower approach, and know what kind of authority can be applied. And I think the reason we've had some success is we've taken on very specific problems. We've had an agreed amount of authority, and you combine that agreed authority with the practical nature of what gets recommended, and we are seeing 80 and 90% of the decisions going through, and often some very, very difficult decisions, not just feel-good decisions, and that's the point of difference. You've had one great trial at a big scale, and it generated good results. Yeah, there's some things that went wrong, but maybe a second trial would be pretty good, and I'd certainly encourage people to compare it with the status quo. Maybe the status quo has had some disappointing results as well along the way.
Very good. Ian, it sounds very exciting, but there will be some listeners who will think maybe, well, democracy has been around for for thousands of years, it seems to be working well, that maybe this idea of maybe experimenting too much risks destabilizing things. Maybe there are some people who are going to be cautious and think, well, it mightn't work perfectly, but it's not a broken system.
Well, I encourage them to maybe reflect that the bits that are working really well are things like our rule of law, our freedom of the press. No one's proposing tinkering with that. I'd challenge them to say, is our public decision-making working well? We certainly have, there's a survey in Australia by the Lowy Institute. When they asked people under 30, was democracy superior to other forms of government? Only 64% said yes. Now, they didn't really have an alternative in mind, but that's the degree of satisfaction. I think it's 8% of people think Congress in the United States does a good job. 8%, I think, is the point at which you start saying, can we innovate? Can we do a little better? And no one's talking about throwing out everything holus bolus and starting again. It's a case of, look, if there's a back and forth between a couple of political parties, and we can come to a point that says, look, make your case to 100 citizens, and if 80%, if 90% of them can agree, then maybe that should carry the day. I think that will change the nature of political debate. We're not talking about ripping out hundreds of people from their current desks, but I think a release valve that gets beyond the simplistic nature of campaign debate, the simplistic nature of trying to win a headline and trying to focus on the next campaign. No, I don't agree that the status quo is worth keeping. I think this is the right risk taken with the right rationale and the right degree of testing.
Okay, Ian, it's been brilliant having you on. Thanks a million for joining us all the way from Australia. Ian Walker, Executive Director. Thanks a million, Ian. Ian Walker, Executive Director of the New Democracy Foundation. You can find out all about them by just Googling the New Democracy Foundation. Some really exciting work there from Australia. And Ian, thanks a million.
Thank you and good night.
Well, welcome back to Talking History as we debate the past, present and future of democracy. Paul, before the break we heard from Ian Walker and some new ideas in Australia, but maybe before we talk about the future of democracy, maybe you might explain to our listeners just how democracy had its big revival in the 17th century and then became so important in the 18th, 19th centuries in the United States, France, all around the world. Why did democracy have this kind of reawakening in those years?
I'm going to cut a lot of corners here, obviously, but it starts really in the Renaissance with Machiavelli, Guicciardini, where the notion of republicanism starts to flourish again. And that, of course, is Roman republicanism, though there was, of course, a Greek writer, Polybius, who offered an analysis of the Roman Republican Constitution, which later thinkers, including the American founding fathers, found quite congenial. It's a notion of mixed constitution, of checks and balances, that sort of notion of where there is a democratic element, but it's not the sole dominant element, as it were. So Machiavelli and so on pick up the baton where it's dropped by, if you like, Cicero and Polybius. And different countries have very different histories. And so the circumstances leading to the English Civil War, some people call it the English Revolution of the 17th century, especially the 1640s and 50s, aren't necessarily replicable in other countries. And so it's, if you like, coincidental or locally important that out of the killing of Charles I, the regicide of 1649, comes the first glimmering of a recrudescence, a recuperation of something like ancient Greek democratic theory. And this is in the work of a man called Harrington, who wrote Oceana. But if I tell you that Cromwell himself, Lord Protector, leader of the parliamentarians against the monarchy, actually thought of taking the title king, and who ruled with quite an iron fist inside a velvet glove, perhaps, nevertheless was not terrifically demotic, shall we say, or democratic in anything like a sense we would welcome. That will give you an idea. This is only a very small beginning, a glimmering. The next great leap forward, as you rightly say, doesn't come for another 100 years. And it's premised upon a whole intellectual development, which for short we call the Enlightenment. And it takes place first in America and then in France. And again, in both cases, for different reasons. It's anti-monarchical, and of course they call the monarchs tyrants. So in our case, in America, George III was a tyrant for the founding fathers, and of course Louis XVI was a kind of tyrant for the French revolutionaries. But the Americans were very explicit. The French didn't have to be quite so explicit. They did not want back the sort of democracy that Plato and Aristotle and most ancient Greek political theorists, members of the elite, had excoriated as not the best way to rule at all, and dangerously like the tyranny of the majority and mob rule. All those arguments used against democracy by Plato and Aristotle were used by the founding fathers. Okay, whatever we're going to have, we're going to call it a republic, and that, of course, includes the word populus. Public comes from the Latin people. So we're going to have the people ruling, but we're not going to have the demos in the old Greek sense. So we have a Senate, we have a Capitol, we don't have a Bouli or an Acropolis in Washington. Following up the French Revolution, the very word democracy starts to be used. Robespierre, of course, right on the left wing of the French Revolution, he gives a speech in which he says, I've heard people using this newfangled word démocratie. Doesn't sound like a good idea to me. And then he rattles off the usual anti-democratic, anti-Greek democratic notions. Of course, he himself would become to be regarded as a kind of tyrant, and he, of course, himself was executed. But there are the glimmerings, and from the beginning of the 19th century, republicanism in the form of representative government, and then ultimately it's called democracy, becomes normal, so that monarchy is now thought to be at a discount. Of course, it hangs on in the form of various emperors until the beginning of the 20th century. But by the beginning of the 20th century, old-fashioned autocratic monarchy is thought to be absolutely passé. Of course, we have lots of dictators around, and we have some hereditary monarchs in our own country here, though they are constitutional monarchs. But by and large, by the end of the 19th century, in the West, democracy, meaning representative democracy, meaning parliamentary democracy, has won.
Excellent. Absolutely brilliant the way you took us through about 5 centuries there.
Cutting corners, as I said.
No, brilliantly done. Rosalind, it's clear there that democracy has evolved. It was changing in ancient Greece. You see the Romans doing different things. It's evolved over the last number of centuries. If you could change one thing about democracy, what would it be?
I think we have to think about how technology has changed the way our societies operate. It's true that the Founding Fathers made a conscious choice against democracy, but another way of looking at it is that at the time, they were constricted by the technology they had. One thing that's different about Athens and modern states is that Athens was a relatively small geographical area where many people could meet face-to-face. A country like the United States, that's no longer possible. You'd have to delegate power somehow to others, and that's part of the reason why we're using the system that we do, where we vote and we send other people to meet face-to-face. We have to think about if that is still necessary today with technology. We know that people can have their say online now very quickly and easily. That's one thing that has changed a lot from the time of the Founding Fathers. Another thing is that the speed at which events occur. Because we're in a very connected and very intercommunicative society now, more happens in 4 years than happened back when, people were wearing powdered wigs and wearing knickerbockers, So I would say that people should realize the possibilities of technology.
Is there a danger that the people who would be voting and deciding issues electronically may not be aware of the ins and outs of all of the issues being voted on, and that you could have some bad decisions then?
I think what's really interesting about democracy in Athens is that it worked as a kind of reinforcing system. You can't just take out one aspect or another aspect and say that's the fundamental of democracy. We have to think also about the way we communicate with each other, about how information is disseminated in our society. Yes, we don't have a guarantee that the vast majority of people would make a good decision. We also, of course, on the other hand, don't have any guarantees that elected leaders will make a good decision. So we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. And I think that part of reviving democracy also has to to look at the way that information is communicated and if that can be a two-way street instead of just a one-way street.
Because there is the danger that, again, some people might be indifferent. They might be the people who actually have maybe the more sensible ideas, because if it's like when an article goes up online, sometimes the people who put all their energies into making comments, sometimes they're not the ones who you might want to have running your country.
Well, I'm sure you, being in media, you're well acquainted with that. But I think something we didn't touch on yet, but is also very interesting, is that the Athenians paid people to participate. So they really encouraged people to get out. That being said, I mean, 100% of people did not participate in every action at Athens. So that's another thing we have to look at, is how can we encourage people who are what we would kind of call the silent majority in political discourse to come out and have their say, because that's also a key point of Athenian democracy, is that one was supposed to get out and get in there in the fight for what the decision would be in that society.
Peter, I've tried to avoid the famous Churchill line about democracy being the worst of all forms, except for all the others. But there is that sense about democracy that maybe even for all its flaws, even for all the criticisms, there is no real enthusiasm for other forms, because they've been shown to not work, and they've been shown to be even worse. Is that a fair assessment, or should we have enthusiasm for democracy?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I think that when you try to describe a realistic alternative to democracy, you very quickly sort of run into all kinds of obstacles. I mean, you talk about the idea that, we'll have an aristocracy, that we'll have rule by the best or something. Well, does that mean that, Zeus is going to come down and, point to the best people for us? They're just going to magically know? I mean, somebody's going to determine that, and by an extraordinary coincidence, the best always seem to turn out to be the richest, the most powerful, the people with the best connections. They always seem to be the best. So I'm very skeptical of going that kind of route. But I think that's the negative side of things. But I think it's also important to remember the positive side of things. I'd say democracy fundamentally involves two ideas: the idea that we collectively together will take charge of our own destiny, and the idea that all of us are free and equal participants in there. And those ideals are so powerful and so important, I think that it's really hard to imagine a system that would be really inspiring that didn't embody those features.
Peter, some would say that we don't really have a democracy anywhere because big businesses control things, that the politicians end up being puppets, that the real decisions are made elsewhere.
It's certainly the problem of the gap between the ideal and the reality, and the question of, if we have the ideal shining there, what kind of institutional innovations can we come up with, like the ones that New Democracy are coming with, that could try to fix some of these problems and make the democracy more real.
Paul, I'll leave the final word to you. Democracy, do we have it, and should we keep working with it?
Yes, we do. And you asked earlier if there were one thing I'd like to change. It would be the abolition, this is rather extreme, deliberately, of the party system. And what I think Ian's New Democracy Foundation is struggling towards is getting away from people who, because they are members of a party, they got elected on a party ticket. They have to sign up, not to what they necessarily themselves believe, but what the whole party has decided will be the manifesto. And very few of us, I think, buy every bit of every party's package, or any party's package.
Brilliant.
I'd like to go back to us being free and equal individual
Brilliant.
voters.
Paul, on that bombshell, we'll end our discussion. My thanks to all my guests, Professor Paul Cartledge of Cambridge, Dr. Rosalind Fuller, Dr. Peter Stone of Trinity, and Ian Walker of New Democracy.